Today, I'm on here to talk about fashion and hip-hop and how the two worlds have always collided. So as y'all know, I'm an independent rapper from Pittsburgh, rap named Gen Ether. So today we're going to focus on how hip-hop and fashion go hand in hand, kind of where it started and where it has evolved to. We'll also talk about some of my influences in fashion from the hip-hop world and where it all began for me, what styles and people I kind of start looking at like, no, I like the way she does that. I like the way he does that. So let's get into it. Hip-hop is a musical phenomenon. It started basically from the lack of musical instruments inside of the schools, the public school system. So the kids in Brooklyn, the kids in the Bronx started using their parents' record players, their parents' records, and scratching, which evolved into what we know of as DJs. And then you got the other elements of hip-hop, which is the fashion, the b-boying, which is breakdancing, and the graffiti, the art of it, which also ties into the fashion world. So right from the beginning, just the elements of hip-hop, with it having a lot to do with art, and then the fashion kind of comes in because they were needing clothes that would fit well for them to do their b-boying. So you needed something comfortable. So that's where we get into the track suits. That's where you get into the Adidas, the Pumas, the Diodora shoes. All of this was for function. Also the Kangol hat. But even when you look at the Kangol hat, when you're spinning, you're not ripping your hair out of your head, you're not causing yourself bald spots, put that hat on. So a lot of fashion that came from hip-hop initially was functional. It was really functionally based. We're going to wear these tracksuits because it's just more comfortable to dance in tracksuits than to dance in slacks. We're going to wear these tennis shoes because it's more comfortable for us to dance in tennis shoes than it is to dance in boots. So this is the origins of hip-hop and fashion beginning to collide. Now, let's remember also, hip-hop takes place right after the crash of disco. So disco goes out, hip-hop begins to emerge. So your first groups that you see in hip-hop, like literally the first hip-hop groups, go back and look at them, a lot of them were still dressed like disco groups. What's the one group? The YMCA guys. I can't think of the name. YMCA, where they had an Indian, a carpenter, a da-da, in the group, talking about the looks of their uniforms. So the first hip-hop groups were still modeling that old school disco look where they were really dressed in costumes, not necessarily streetwear. As hip-hop, the sound starts to evolve, so does the look of hip-hop. So like I said, as the b-boy and all that really gets put into place, that's where you start to see the tracksuits come in, the tennis shoes come in, the Kangol hats, stuff like that. Now, as we move on, the sound of hip-hop begins to change. The 90s gets ushered in. So now the 90s brings in more of a gritty sound. The 80s, early hip-hop, like I said, it started with disco, enters in hip-hop. Because hip-hop definitely had a lot of reminiscent traits of disco. Like I said, you had the costumes for their stage performance, and you also had a lot of color. And it was party music. So the hip hop, the hippie to the hippie to the hip hop, you don't stop. Have you ever gone over a friend's house to eat and the food just ain't no good? Hey, it was that type of vibe when hip hop first started. It was like one big ass party, which made sense because disco was one big ass party. So it made sense coming from that era to still keep that party element going, and it still was made for the nightclubs, just like disco. Disco was a nightclub thing. Hip-hop, after it evolved from just being in the streets where it initially started, it moved into the nightclub. So those party songs kept everyone on the dance floor. So now you move into the 90s, we got different acts coming up, and the other acts who kind of initially started this thing off, they're kind of starting to fade into the background of the art form. So with the new acts, you got people like DMX, Jay-Z, Scarface, Tupac, Biggie Smalls. These are the new emerging acts. Jada Kiss, The Lox, everyone's starting to come up, but they're now putting more of a street element into it. Now it would be, I have to start with the first group who gets the claim to fame for this. It would be NWA, with how they spoke I mean, they were speaking on police brutality, on what they were seeing going on in California. So they were speaking on their hood from their perspective growing up in the hood. So their clothes reflected it. So we got away from all the bright reds, greens, blues, those 90 colors that were fun to play with, and we started really getting into more of a black, white, gray aesthetic. I mean, and also with that, we changed the silhouette of the clothes. So no longer were the clothes tight and form-fitting. Everything got super baggy. From the shirts to the pants, everything was a bigger silhouette in the 90s. And it really reflected the street, the hood shit that was going on in the music. Now, right before then, you did have the play on the African aesthetic. You know what I mean? So don't forget, there's a lot of 5%ers inside of hip hop, a lot of Zulu Nation. So we also always had a lot of cultural clothing. We always had a lot of things that represented the African diaspora as well. But like I said, once you move into gangster rap, you start seeing less of the colors, you start seeing less of the African diaspora, you start seeing less of the kente cloth type of designs, and you start getting more into bigger clothes, black, white, gray, browns. And that's where hip-hop and fashion kind of stayed and played for a long time. Now, let's get into some of the spearheads, the people that really put in that work for us. You go back to the early days, after the costume era, when hip-hop kind of started adopting more of that street look, a lot of credit must go to Dapper Dan. Dapper Dan was a black stylist in New York who was taking the high-end designs like Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and he was basically customizing the clothes and making them for the street. So he was taking high-end fashion and customizing it and basically converting it into streetwear. Then it was the hustlers, the drug dealers, everyone who was popping, who had real bread, was shopping with Dapper Dan. So when the rappers get on, get their deals, get their money, they already know exactly who they want to look like. They want to look like the dudes in the streets getting the bread. So they begin, because they're now allotted the opportunity, because they got rap money, to go to Dapper Dan. This in turn puts Dapper Dan on the map, because no matter what, the street guys is keeping your pockets fat, but it's the rappers that are now putting your designs on a national syndicated type of situation. Now, when they turn on MTV BET and see this shirt, that was something that the hustler couldn't necessarily give you. So Dapper Dan gets the credit as one of the very first streetwear designers. Now, he never really got the credit he deserved. In fact, the high-end fashion houses shut Dapper Dan down early, and he kind of faded into the background because he really couldn't do, I mean, they caught him up on, copyright infringement, stuff like that. You're dealing with the IP, the intellectual property of these big fashion houses. So Dapper Dan got shut down. He later emerged maybe 5 to 10 years ago with a deal with Gucci. So it was cool that they paid homage, but there's a reason why you don't really know about Dapper Dan. But if you turn on movies like Paid in Full, you see Dapper Dan everywhere. Them Gucci's with the G's everywhere, them leather jackets, that vest that Cameron has on, Dapper Dan. You know what I mean? So you know the look of Dapper Dan. You just don't know Dapper Dan because they did come in, shut him down, and he just started getting his recognition again. So let's move on from Dapper Dan. But I brought him up because he is pretty much the beginning of streetwear, hip-hop, and fashion coming together, colliding together, and high-end fashion, all colliding together at one point in time. So they shut Dapper Dan down, but remember, New York, it's the mecca of hip-hop, it's the mecca of fashion, it's the mecca of hip-hop and fashion right now because of Dapper Dan. So a lot of these guys from New York who had their businesses, their record companies in New York, already peeped game, saw what it was. So that's how you're able to get a Russell Simmons with Fat Farm. You know what I mean? That's how you're able to get Dame Dash and Jay-Z with Rocawear. Let's go back a little farther. Right after Dapper Dan, you had someone like Karl Kani, who Tupac and a lot of other rappers was pushing their brand. Then you move up to the future, right before, I think, Jay and Dame, you got FUBU coming in. So right after Dapper Dan, he was able to influence a lot of us, people who look like us, to get into the cut and